Ethan Carrington's mansion was the kind of place people imagined when they thought of untouchable wealth. A towering structure of glass and steel, perched high on the hills above the city. From the outside, it looked like a temple to success. Inside, it felt more like a vault. No family photographs, no clutter, no warmth. Just clean lines, chrome finishes, and an emptiness that matched its owner. He liked it that way. The world was messy. People were messier, especially women. In his experience, their smiles hid agendas, their affection came with price tags, and their love was nothing more than a transaction. Ethan had learned young that his fortune was a magnet for greed, for deceit, for people who saw him as a ladder, not a man. So he kept his life locked down, controlled, isolated. The only person who breached his fortress willingly was Victor Carrington, his grandfather. Victor was nothing like Ethan. Warm where Ethan was cold, approachable where Ethan was guarded. But Victor was also frail now, skin paper thin, his voice edged with the weight of years. Every Sunday, Victor would arrive unannounced, cane tapping, against the marble floor, wearing the same brown wool coat no matter the season. Ethan always offered him a drink, and Victor always refused, choosing instead to sit by the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the view as if searching for a memory just out of reach. This Sunday started like all the others, until it didn't. Ethan had been halfway through an email when he heard the cane drop, followed by a heavy, muffled thud. He turned sharply. Victor was on the floor, his face pale, his lips moving without sound. For a split second, Ethan froze, his controlled world cracking under the pressure of real fear. "Grandpa, stay with me," he said, crouching beside him. He reached for his phone, fingers fumbling as he dialed the private medical line he paid for but never expected to use. Within minutes, a black-clad emergency team was at the door. They worked silently and efficiently, transferring Victor onto a stretcher. Ethan followed, his usual indifference gone, replaced by something sharper, a gnawing dread he couldn't name. The drive to the hospital was a blur of city lights and muted sirens. Ethan sat rigid in the leather seat of the ambulance, his gaze locked on Victor's hand, lying limp against the blanket. At Carrington Medical, the private facility his family had endowed decades ago, they swept Victor into an examination room. Doctors moved quickly, monitors beeped steadily, and Ethan stood outside the glass wall watching. For the first time in years, he felt powerless. When the attending physician stepped out, Ethan intercepted him. "How bad is it?" The doctor hesitated. "His heart is under immense strain. We're stabilizing him, but he needs rest, constant care." Ethan nodded, jaw tight, though the words landed heavy in his chest. "Do whatever it takes." He turned to leave, but through the glass he caught something, a nurse, her back to him, adjusting Victor's blanket. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate, almost tender. She said something he couldn't hear, and Victor's mouth curved into the faintest smile. Ethan blinked. He hadn't seen his grandfather smile like that in months. The nurse didn't. "Look his way." She seemed oblivious to him, her focus entirely on the old man in the bed. For reasons he couldn't explain, the sight unsettled him. He shook it off, retreating to the waiting area. Outside, the rain had begun, streaking the glass walls of the hospital. The city below blurred, lights smearing into muted gold and red. Ethan leaned back in the leather chair, telling himself it was exhaustion making him think about that nurse at all. Still, when the doctor returned to say Victor was stable enough to be moved to a private room, Ethan's first question wasn't about medication or prognosis. Will she be the one taking care of him? The doctor's brow furrowed. "Nurse Maya?" "Yes, she's on night shift." Ethan didn't know why he felt a flicker of relief at that answer. He told himself it didn't matter, but somewhere deep down, something in his fortress had just shifted, and He had no idea that this crack in the walls he'd built would soon become the doorway that changed everything. Ethan followed the orderly down the hushed corridor, the sterile scent of antiseptic thick in the air. The walls were a uniform white, broken only by muted blue doors with silver numbers. At the end of the hall, the orderly stopped at 314. Inside, the room was blindingly clean. White sheets, white curtains, white walls. The only color came from the soft amber glow of a bedside lamp, casting a halo over Victor's face. Standing beside him was the nurse Ethan had glimpsed earlier. She was adjusting the pillow beneath Victor's head, her movements efficient but gentle, as if every action carried thought. Her dark hair was pulled into a low bun, a few strands loose around her face. She didn't look up when Ethan entered. "Comfortable now?" she asked quietly, her voice low and even. Victor nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. Ethan froze, mid-step. That smile again, the one he'd almost forgotten existed. "I'll check your vitals in an hour, Mr. Carrington," she continued, brushing a wrinkle from the sheet. "If you need anything before that, just press the call button. I'll come right away." Ethan cleared his throat. "I'm his grandson." Only then did she glance at him, briefly. Her gaze was calm, unreadable, before she turned back to the chart in her hands. "You'll want to keep your visits short. He needs rest." It wasn't dismissive, it was factual. She spoke to him the way she might to any stranger passing through the ward, without the faintest hint of deference that Ethan had come to expect from people who knew who he was. He stepped closer to the bed, looking down at Victor. "You doing okay?" Victor's voice was thin. "Better than I was an hour ago." He turned his eyes toward the nurse, the corners of his mouth lifting again. "Thanks to Maya here." Maya, Ethan's gaze flicked back to her. "I appreciate you looking after him?" She gave a short nod without meeting his eyes. "It's my job." The words were simple, but something in her tone made Ethan feel as though she was drawing a boundary, one he wasn't invited to cross. He lingered by the bed, watching as she adjusted an IV line with practiced precision. Her hands were steady, her focus unshakable. She spoke softly to Victor, asking about his pain, his comfort, the way he liked his blankets tucked. She never once addressed Ethan again. The detachment was unfamiliar. Most people in his presence overcompensated. Eager smiles, small talk, strategic compliments. Maya, on the other hand, behaved as though he were just another visitor taking up space. When she finally left, the room seemed emptier. Ethan sat beside Victor, still thinking about the way she'd spoken to him. "Don't scare her off," Victor murmured, eyes half closed. Ethan frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" His grandfather's lips curved in the faintest grin. "You've got that look, like you're trying to solve a puzzle." "I'm not." Victor didn't press, but Ethan could tell. He'd been caught. Minutes later, Maya returned with a tray. She set it down, checked Victor's vitals, and without a word to Ethan, slipped out again. Ethan watched her go, the door clicking softly behind her. The sound seemed to echo louder than it should. Have. For the rest of the evening, he caught himself glancing at the door, waiting for her to return. Not because he needed anything, but because something about her presence, her unwavering focus on his grandfather, stirred an unfamiliar restlessness in him. When the shift changed and another nurse took over, Ethan felt a strange flicker of disappointment. He told himself it didn't matter, but as he walked out of room 314, the name stayed with him. Maya. The days blurred together in a quiet rhythm of hospital visits. But that evening, the air felt different the moment Ethan stepped into room 314. He paused at the doorway. Victor was sitting up in bed, shoulders relaxed, eyes lit in a way Ethan hadn't seen in years. Across from him sat Maya, perched on the edge of a chair, telling a story with her hands. Her voice was low, but Victor's reaction was clear. He was laughing. Not the polite chuckle he gave to ease a conversation along, but a full, unguarded laugh that reached his eyes. Ethan's chest tightened unexpectedly. He couldn't remember the last time his grandfather had laughed like that in his presence. "What's so funny?" Ethan asked, stepping inside. Maya glanced up briefly, offering the faintest of smiles before turning back to Victor. "Just an old story about his army days." Victor chuckled again, shaking his head. "She's got a way of telling it better than I ever could." Ethan moved to stand beside the bed, his gaze shifting between the two of them. "I didn't know you talked about that time much." "I don't," Victor replied, the smile still lingering. But she asked the right questions. Something about that answer unsettled Ethan. He'd tried countless times to draw out the same warmth from his grandfather, but it had never been this easy. Maya rose, smoothing the front of her uniform. "He needs to rest now." Ethan almost protested, but Victor nodded in agreement. "She's right." After she left, Ethan sat in the chair she had just occupied. "You seem different tonight." Victor leaned back, eyes half closed. "She reminds me of your grandmother." Ethan frowned. "How?" "She cared without wanting anything in return," Victor said softly. "That's rare. You don't see it much anymore." Ethan didn't respond right away. He wanted to argue. Wanted to say that everyone wanted something, but the sincerity in Victor's tone made the words stick in his throat. "You think you know people, Ethan," Victor went on, "but you've built a life that keeps you from ever really finding out." Ethan crossed his arms, deflecting. "And you think she's different?" "I don't think," Victor said, his eyes opening to meet Ethan's. "I know." The conversation ended there, Victor closing his eyes again as if the effort of speaking had drained him. That night, Ethan lay awake in his penthouse, the city spread out beneath him like a glittering map. But instead of focusing on the next day's meetings or the contracts waiting for his signature, his mind kept circling back to that laugh. The sound of it was foreign in his memory, almost jarring. He saw the way Victor's eyes softened when Maya spoke, the way her presence seemed to quiet the air in the room. He tried to dismiss it. She was just a nurse doing her job. But something about her deliberate detachment, her refusal to cater to him the way others did, made her stand out in a way he couldn't ignore. He turned onto his side, staring at the skyline through the glass wall. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time he closed his eyes, the image returned. His grandfather smiling, his guard down, in a way Ethan had never been able to create. By morning, he knew one thing for certain. Maya was no longer just part of his grandfather's care. She had become a puzzle he needed to understand. And puzzles, Ethan had never been able to leave unsolved. The next evening, Ethan arrived later than usual. Visiting hours were nearly over, the corridors quieter, shadows stretching long beneath the muted ceiling lights. He'd intended to check in on Victor quickly, but as he approached room 314, he caught the low murmur of voices coming from the nurses' station around the corner. He slowed his steps. "Shame what happened to her family," one voice said, a younger nurse with a nervous laugh. The other replied softly, "Not something you just get over. Losing your brother like that. And the way it happened? No one talks about it, but..." Her voice trailed off as she noticed someone walking past. Ethan lingered just out of sight, his pulse quickening. The younger nurse whispered, "I heard it was suspicious. Never solved. Some people think..." A door opened down the hall, cutting her off. By the time Ethan turned the corner, both nurses were gone, leaving only the faint scent of antiseptic in the air. He stood there for a moment, the fragments of their conversation replaying in his head. A brother. Lost. Suspicious circumstances. He couldn't imagine that kind of loss, and he hated that his first instinct was to wonder how it had shaped Maya into the woman she was now. Inside room 314, Victor was asleep. Maya was adjusting the drip line, her face composed, her hands steady as ever. "Evening," Ethan said, stepping inside. She glanced at him briefly. "He's had a good day. Vitals are stable." "I heard something," he began, moving closer. "About you." Her eyes lifted, guarded. "About me?" He nodded. "A personal matter. Your brother." The silence that followed was sharp, almost metallic. Maya's expression didn't change, but the air between them thickened. "That's not relevant to Mr. Carrington's care," she said evenly. She cut him off. "You're here for him, not for me. Keep it that way." Her tone wasn't hostile, but it carried an edge that told him the subject was closed. Most people tried to curry his favor. They sought his attention, his approval. Maya did the opposite. She shut the door in his face without hesitation. Ethan should have walked away. But instead, he leaned against the wall, watching her as she worked. "You don't like talking about yourself." "I'm not here to talk about myself," she replied, her back to him. He studied her posture, the way she straightened the sheets, the way she avoided unnecessary conversation. It wasn't shyness, it was intention. When she finally turned toward him, her eyes were calm, unflinching. "If you care about your grandfather's recovery, you'll respect my boundaries." Ethan's jaw tightened. Boundaries can be flexible, not these. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, his curiosity pressing against her silence holding firm. Finally, she moved past him toward the door. "Good night, Mr. Carrington." He didn't correct her formality, though a part of him wanted to hear her say his first name. After she left, Ethan sat beside Victor's bed, staring at the floor. He told himself it was irritation that kept him thinking about her, that he didn't, like being shut out. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. He wanted to know what had happened to her brother. He wanted to know why she guarded her life so fiercely, why she could make his grandfather smile without effort while keeping Ethan himself at arm's length. It wasn't attraction, not exactly. It was a challenge, and Ethan had never been able to leave a challenge unanswered. In the hallway, the faint sound of her voice drifted back, speaking to another patient. Warm, steady, unshakable. Ethan leaned back in the chair, eyes narrowing. If she thought her past was going to remain hidden, she didn't know him very well. Not yet. The hospital was silent except for the low hum of machinery and the distant beeping of monitors. Visiting hours had long ended, but Ethan remained in the armchair beside Victor's bed, scrolling absently through emails he wasn't reading. The sound of his grandfather's voice broke the quiet. "Ethan, turn that thing off." Ethan looked up. Victor's eyes were open, glassy under the dim bedside lamp. "You should be sleeping," Ethan said, setting the phone aside. "I need to tell you something," Victor replied, his voice faint but firm. "While I still can." Ethan sat forward. "What is it?" Victor's gaze drifted toward the ceiling. "There are things I've done, decisions I made when I ran the company. Not all of them were clean." Ethan frowned. "Business is never clean," Victor shook his head. "This wasn't just business. This was people's lives." He swallowed hard before continuing. "Years ago, we acquired a small manufacturing plant. It was family-owned. We forced a sale, pressured them until they broke. I told myself it was strategy, but it destroyed them." Ethan stayed quiet, sensing this wasn't just an old man's regret. They lost everything. The father drank himself to death within a year. The mother, God help her, tried to hold on, but his voice faltered. They had children. "A son, a daughter. I think the boy died young." "Accident." Or maybe not an accident. Ethan's chest tightened. You're saying... Victor nodded slowly. I heard her name once. The daughter's name. Maya. The name landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. Ethan leaned back, pulse rising. You think she's our nurse? I don't think, Victor said, his eyes locking on Ethan's. I know. Ethan's mind replayed every moment with her, the detachment, the boundaries, the way she had looked at him as if she already knew what kind of man he was. Does she know about any of this? Victor exhaled shakily. I don't know. But if she does, she's shown me more grace than I deserve. Ethan stood, running a hand through his hair. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because you do what you always do, Victor said, his voice suddenly sharp. You'd turn it into strategy. You'd look for an angle. This is about more than you or me. It's about the cost of power, a cost you've never had to pay. The words stung, though Ethan wouldn't admit it. He glanced toward the door, half expecting Maya to appear as if summoned by the weight of her name. But the hall was empty. Ethan, Victor continued, softer. Now don't make my mistakes. If you ever get the chance to do right by her, take it. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing. He felt the floor shift beneath him, not physically, but in the way that comes when a truth rewrites everything you thought you knew. Victor closed his eyes, his breathing evening out again. The conversation was over, but the echo of it clung to the room like a ghost. Ethan stepped out into the corridor. The lights overhead cast a sterile glow, but his thoughts were anything but clean. If what Victor said was true, then Maya's silence wasn't just professional, it was deliberate. She had been walking into that room every day, caring for the man who dismantled her family without a single word of accusation. That kind of control? He didn't know if it was admirable or terrifying. He headed toward the elevator, but halfway there he stopped. Through the glass panel of another patient's door, he caught sight of her. Maya was leaning over an elderly woman's bed, her hand resting gently on the woman's arm. Her face lit with quiet compassion. It was the same expression she'd given Victor. No more, no less, and yet Ethan couldn't shake the question pounding. In his mind, did she already know exactly who he was? The call came at 3:14 a.m. Ethan was already awake, pacing the length of his penthouse with a drink he hadn't touched. The hospital's night nurse spoke in a tone that was soft, almost apologetic. It's your grandfather. You should come now. He arrived within 20 minutes. The corridors hushed and dim. Room 314's door was ajar, a thin strip of light, spilling into the hallway. Inside, Victor lay propped slightly against his pillows, his skin pale and waxen, every breath a shallow rise and fall. Beside him sat Maya, her hand clasped around his. She was murmuring something low, her face close to his, as if her voice alone might anchor him here a little longer. Ethan froze in the doorway. Victor's eyes flickered open, cloudy but still sharp enough to recognize her. His lips moved. She leaned closer, listening intently. Whatever he said made her nod once, a faint smile touching her lips. Ethan stepped forward. Grandpa? Victor's gaze shifted toward him, but it was distant now, as though the effort to focus was too great. The sound that escaped his lips was barely a breath. Ethan moved closer, straining to hear, but the words were not for him. A long pause, a soft exhale, and then nothing. The stillness that followed was absolute. Ethan's stomach dropped, the room tilting slightly around him. He watched as Maya reached up and gently closed Victor's eyes, her thumb brushing over his temple in a motion so tender it was almost intimate. I'm sorry, she said quietly, her voice steady. Ethan swallowed hard. What? What did he say to you? Maya didn't answer right away. She adjusted the blanket, smoothed the sheets, movements methodical, almost ceremonial. "Maya," he pressed, his voice low but urgent. "I need to know." She turned to face him then. Her eyes were calm, not cold, but unreadable in a way that made his chest tighten. Those words were his to give, not mine to share. "That's not good enough," Ethan snapped, the edge in his tone sharper than he intended. "It's all I can give you." She stepped past him toward the door. He caught a trace of her perfume, subtle, clean, before she was gone. Ethan stood there, staring at the space she'd occupied, the sound of the monitor's flatline echoing in his head. Power had always been his currency. Information, leverage, these were the tools he used to stay in control, and yet in that moment he had nothing. She walked away with a piece of his grandfather he would never touch. The hours that followed were a blur of forms to sign, hushed condolences from staff, and the cold efficiency of hospital protocol. By the time he stepped outside, dawn was breaking. The city bathed in a muted gray light. He should have been thinking about funeral arrangements, about the legacy Victor left behind. Instead, he kept replaying the scene in his head, the way Victor had looked at her, the private exchange he hadn't been invited into. In all the years Ethan had known his grandfather, the old man had never held back a truth from him. Until now. And the one person who could answer his questions had just walked away without a single backward glance. The rain hadn't stopped since the funeral. A steady, relentless drizzle blurred the glass walls of the law office where Ethan sat. Shoulders stiff, hands clasped tightly in his lap. The executor, an older man with thin, silver hair, shuffled papers with the kind of measured calm only lawyers possessed. "Mr. Carrington," he began, "your grandfather's estate is vast, but his wishes are straightforward. All holdings, properties, and assets are to be transferred solely to you." Ethan nodded, unsurprised. He'd built much of his fortune on top of the family's legacy. This was an extension of that inevitability. The lawyer hesitated before reaching for a smaller envelope. "There is one personal item." He slid it across the desk. "Not for you, for a Miss Maya Alvarado." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "The nurse?" The lawyer inclined his head. "Victor was very specific. It is sealed. I have not read it." The envelope was cream-colored, Victor's handwriting precise across. The front. For Maya. Ethan ran his thumb over the ink, a strange tightness in his chest. "What's in it?" "That," the lawyer said with the faintest smile, "is not mine to know." By the time Ethan left the office, the weight of the envelope his pocket felt heavier than it should have. He told himself it was curiosity. But as his car wound through the rain-slick streets toward the hospital, he knew it was more than that. Maya was between shifts, exiting the staff entrance with her coat collar turned up against the drizzle. When she saw him waiting by the curb, her steps slowed. "Mr. Carrington," she said, her tone neutral, "I have something for you." He reached into his coat and held out the envelope. Her eyes flicked to the handwriting. For the first time since he'd met her, her composure faltered, just slightly. She took it without a word. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Open it." She glanced at him, then slipped a finger beneath the flap. Inside was a single sheet of stationery and a small brass key. Her eyes scanned the handwriting, Victor's, her lips pressing into a line as she read. Ethan tried to read her face, but she gave nothing away. "Well?" "It's personal," she said, folding the letter back into the envelope. "You're going to have to do better than that," he replied, a sharper edge to his voice than he intended. "He whispered something to you before he died. Now he leaves you a key. You expect me not to ask questions?" Her gaze met his, calm, but unyielding. "Your questions aren't my obligation to answer." "What's the key for?" "A safety deposit box," she said after a pause. downtown. What's in it? I don't know, and I won't know until I open it. She tucked the envelope into her coat pocket. But I don't think it's something you're entitled to. The restraint in her voice stung more than open defiance would have. You think you can just— Yes, she cut in. I can. For a long moment, they stood in the rain, the space between them taut with unspoken things. Then she stepped back, giving him the faintest nod. Thank you for delivering it. He watched her walk away, the envelope protected under her arm as though it were something fragile. Back in his car, Ethan gripped the steering wheel, jaw tight. Every instinct told him this wasn't just some sentimental gift. Victor had never been a man of sentiment. If Maya had been entrusted with something, especially something locked away, it meant it had value, not just in money, but in truth. And if that truth tied to the confession Victor had made before his death, it could be the key to understanding everything Maya had refused to tell him. One way or another, Ethan decided he would find out what was inside that box. 2 days later, Ethan found himself standing in the cold marble lobby of a downtown bank, watching Maya approach with the envelope in hand. She hadn't invited him. She hadn't even told him when she planned to open the box. He had found out through the branch manager, a man who knew exactly who Ethan Carrington was and didn't dare refuse him access to the viewing room. Maya didn't look surprised to see him. Couldn't. Stay away? She asked quietly. I don't like unanswered questions, he said. She sighed but didn't argue, handing over her ID to the teller. Minutes later, they were escorted into a small, private room where the safety deposit box sat on a polished wooden table. The clerk left them alone. Maya slid the brass key into the lock, her fingers steady. The mechanism clicked open, the sound louder than it should have been in the quiet. She lifted the lid. Inside, neatly stacked, were old photographs, envelopes, and a leather-bound notebook worn at the edges. A faint scent of paper and time rose from the box. Maya reached for the top photograph. It showed a modest brick building, faded signage above the door. My father's factory, she said, before your family took it. Ethan's chest tightened. She placed it aside, pulling out another photo, her father and brother, standing in front of the same building, their smiles broad, their clothes worn but clean. This was before everything fell apart. Beneath the photographs were letters, typed, signed, stamped with the Carrington Company seal. Ethan recognized the logo immediately. They were dated decades ago, detailing the acquisition Victor had spoken of. The language was cold, clinical. Failure to comply will result in foreclosure. Maya slid the stack toward him. This is the proof my family never had in writing, proof that it wasn't just bad luck. It was calculated. Ethan's jaw clenched. Why would he give this to you? Because he knew it was the only way to give my family closure, she said softly. And maybe because, in the end, he regretted it. She opened the leather notebook last. Inside were handwritten entries, Victor's journal. The first page she turned to was dated just a few months before his death. I cannot undo what I've done, but perhaps I can give her the truth, even if it paints me a villain. Ethan stared at the words. You think I was here by chance? Maya said, meeting his eyes. But I chose to take this job. I needed to see him, to decide for myself whether forgiveness was possible. And was it? Ethan asked. Maya closed the notebook carefully, placing it back in the box. It was enough. He searched her face, looking for resentment, anger, anything he could use to define her feelings. But there was only calm, the kind that comes after a decision has already been made. You could have gone to the press with this, he said. I didn't want money or revenge. I wanted to look the man responsible in the eye and know he understood. What he'd done She lifted the lid again, sliding everything neatly back into place. "Now I do." When the clerk returned to escort her out, Ethan remained seated, staring at the closed box. Her presence in Victor's final days wasn't coincidence. It had been purpose, and maybe mercy. As they stepped out into the street, the winter air, sharp against their faces, Ethan realized he didn't know which unsettled him more, her forgiveness or the fact that she hadn't extended it to him. The meeting at the bank should have been the last time Ethan saw her outside the hospital. It wasn't. A week later, he found himself standing at the entrance to a quiet corner cafe, watching Maya through the glass. She sat alone at a table near the window, a paperback in her hand, steam curling from the mug in front of her. She looked unguarded. When he stepped inside, she glanced up, surprised but not startled. "Mr. Carrington," she said, marking her place in the book. "Ethan," he corrected. "I was hoping we could talk. About my grandfather." Her brow lifted slightly, but after a pause, she gestured to the empty chair across from her. 15 minutes. They ordered coffee. The first few minutes were filled with polite small talk. Victor's habits, the way he'd complained about hospital food, the stories he'd told about his youth. But gradually, the conversation shifted. "You've changed. Since the first day I met you," she said, stirring her drink slowly. "How so? You looked at people like they were transactions." She met his eyes. "Now you actually listen." He leaned back. "I didn't grow up in a world that rewarded trust. Neither did I." He hesitated, fingers drumming against the table before he spoke again. "When I was 10, my mother left. She took money from my father's accounts, ran off with someone else. I remember hearing my father say, 'Never let a woman close enough to ruin you.' And I didn't. Not until—" His voice trailed off. "Not until Maya Alvarado?" She finished softly. A faint smile touched his lips. "You have a way of making people say things they don't plan to." "That's not me," she said. "That's you wanting to be heard." He looked down at his coffee. "I've spent my life making sure no one could hurt me, and maybe I've mistaken that for strength." "Maybe," she agreed, "because real strength is letting someone see you even when you're afraid they won't like what they find." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Outside, the late afternoon light slanted through the window, casting a warm glow over her face. She wasn't leaning forward to convince him of anything. She wasn't trying to win him. She was simply there, steady, unshaken, and entirely present. "Do you ever regret forgiving him?" he asked quietly. Her expression softened. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing what someone did. It's about freeing yourself from carrying it every day." He studied her, realizing she lived by those words. And for the first time in years, he wondered if he could too. Their 15 minutes stretched to an hour. The conversation moved from Victor to books, from books to music, from music to the small, strange habits that made people human. Ethan found himself telling her things he'd never said aloud. How silence made him uneasy, how he hated sleeping in the dark, how he sometimes dreamed of running away from everything. She didn't laugh. She didn't judge. When they finally stood to leave, the air between them felt different. Less like a battle line, more like a fragile bridge. As they stepped out into the cool evening, Ethan caught himself hoping she'd agree to see him again. Not to talk about Victor. Not even to talk about the past. Just to be in her company. But he didn't ask. Not yet. Maya glanced at him with a small smile. "You're not as much of a fortress as you think." And for the first time, he didn't mind hearing it. Spring arrived with a kind of clarity Ethan hadn't felt in years. The Carrington Free Medical Clinic stood on a quiet corner of the city's east side, a sleek, modern space built where an abandoned warehouse once decayed. The plaque near the entrance read, "In memory of Victor Carrington. For the people who need it most." It had taken months of planning, funding, and negotiating with the city. But the most deliberate choice Ethan had made was the one standing in the reception area that morning. Maya, wearing soft blue scrubs and a name badge that read Lead Nurse. The place was already alive with movement. Volunteers bustled in, and out of exam rooms, patients filled chairs in the waiting area, and the scent of fresh paint still clung faintly to the air. Ethan stood near the entrance, half hidden, watching her. She knelt beside a little boy with a scraped knee, her voice gentle, but sure as she applied a fresh bandage. The boy grinned, showing a missing tooth. A mother nearby whispered a thank you, eyes wet. Maya just smiled and moved on to the next patient. There was nothing guarded in her expression now, no walls, no calculation. It was a kind of joy, Ethan, recognized only because he had never felt it himself. When she finally noticed him, her steps slowed as she crossed the room. "You came," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "I wasn't going to miss this," he replied. "You've made it. More than I imagined." She glanced around, her gaze softening. "It's not mine. It's ours. Victor's name might be on the wall, but you built the space for them." He hesitated before speaking again. "I didn't do it for Victor. Not entirely." Maya studied him for a long moment. "Then who did you do it for?" He let the silence stretch, the truth sitting heavy between them. "For the person who taught me that doing something good doesn't always have to be a transaction." Her expression shifted, part surprise, part understanding. She didn't press further. They moved toward the lobby windows together, watching as a group of children played near the reception desk, their laughter echoing off the walls. "Places like this, they're rare," she said quietly. "And they matter more than you know." He nodded, his voice lower now. "I'm starting to understand that." For the first time, standing there with her, Ethan didn't feel the need to be in control. He didn't feel the impulse to guard every word. He just was. And it terrified him in a way that felt strangely exhilarating. Across the room, a volunteer called her name. She glanced back at him. "I should get back to work." Of course. But before she turned away, she touched his arm, a brief, grounding gesture. Victor would be proud. He watched her walk back into the crowd, her voice blending into the hum of the clinic. Outside, sunlight spilled through the glass, cutting sharp lines across the floor. Ethan stayed a while longer, leaning against the wall, letting the sound of children's laughter and the steady rhythm of the place sink into him. For the first time in years, he felt something new. Not victory, not possession, hope. And as he left the building, stepping into the crisp air, he realized it was the one thing he didn't want to lose. Ethan's office was different now. It wasn't the sterile, imposing space it once was, though the clean lines and glass walls remained. On the far wall above the sideboard hung a single framed photograph. It had been taken at the clinic's opening day. Victor sat in a wheelchair, his shoulders slightly hunched but his eyes alive. Beside him stood Maya, leaning in just enough that their arms touched, both of them caught mid-laughter. The smile on Victor's face was unguarded, bright in a way Ethan hadn't seen in years. And Maya's, hers was softer, but it carried the same quiet depth that had changed the way Ethan saw the world. He'd had the picture enlarged, the grain softened, the colors balanced until the light on their faces looked almost timeless. Some mornings, he'd pause in front of it before heading into the day, coffee in hand, letting his eyes linger on the details. The faint lines at the corners of Victor's eyes, the way Maya's hair caught the sunlight. It wasn't nostalgia exactly. It was something quieter. Late nights were different. When the office was silent and the city stretched out below like a living constellation, Loneliness sometimes crept in, uninvited. It came in the pauses between emails, in the empty hum of the elevator after everyone else had gone home. That's when he'd look at the photo again. It reminded him that people could change, not overnight, not without work, but in small, steady shifts. It reminded him that his grandfather had left him more than a fortune. He'd left him a lesson Ethan hadn't known he needed, and sometimes, though he would never say it out loud, Ethan would feel the corners of his own mouth lift, just slightly. Once, Maya caught him looking at it during one of her rare visits to his office. She'd brought paperwork for the clinic, her hair still tied back from her shift. "You like that one?" she'd said, setting the folder down. "It's the last photo I have of him," he replied. "It's the truest one." She studied the image for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Then it's worth keeping where you can see it." She left soon after, the scent of her perfume lingering in the space, faint but unmistakable. Now, standing there alone, Ethan let the silence settle around him. The city lights glimmered beyond the glass. The photo caught the glow just right, Victor's smile almost seeming to shift in the frame. It was a reminder of the man Victor had been at his best, and of the woman who had walked into their lives without asking for anything, and left behind something neither of them could name. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight in his chest lighter than it used to be. When the loneliness came, he no longer tried to bury it. Some days he even welcomed it, because it meant he still cared. And some nights, when the quiet was just right, he found himself smiling too, just like his grandfather once did.